Thanks a lot for having me. Good morning, everyone. My name is ARESTEH. This is still too loud, I think. Right? Any feedback? Too loud. Try again. 1, 2, 3. Let's try this. Okay. All right. Hopefully this is better. Right. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for having me. This is my first time at B-Sides. I do have to speak a bit low because it just goes crazy. I was asking Charles and Rowan about, everything about B-Sides, the profile of the participants, and typical topics that are presented in the conference. One thing I forgot to ask was the dress code. I normally don't like ties. I don't wear ties. I try to avoid them as much as I can, so please don't judge me. So I guess maybe a quick introduction. I'm the director of Mandiant Consulting Services based in Toronto. I've been with the organization for about 2.5 years, and I basically respond to breaches, helping organizations to be more proactive in becoming more resilient against cyber attacks, but also when they're compromised, they call us in and perform instant response and try to remove the attackers from the network. And then a bit of a quick background on Mandiant. At Mandiant, we respond to cybersecurity breaches. If there was one thing that we learned over the past decade of responding to most sophisticated and complex security breaches is that there is no such thing as perfect security. We are going to continue to see organizations getting breached. The reality of the cyber today is that there is no fear of repercussion, and processes, technologies, people are going to continue to fail to stop the attackers from getting in. And unfortunately, these realities are going to continue for a number of reasons. The most important thing is that the exposure is going to continue to grow. Our networks are going to expand in terms of the technology footprint, the use of cloud, Internet of Things, interconnected business processes, channel strategies. All of these are going to result in networks that are basically wider, bigger exposure, and harder to protect. We no longer can be only worried about the stuff that are in our network. We need to worry about the assets, people, the personal laptops, BYODs, and so forth. At the same time, attackers are, not necessarily exploiting systems. There's a lot of focus on securing systems and networks, but almost in every breach that we have responded to, we find that attackers are targeting the users, right? And they are basically targeting the user trust, and there is no patch for human. So we're going to see them continue to try to be able to bypass these, the controls that we implement at our borders, at the perimeters, to gain access to our systems, leveraging the human factor, and then from there on exploiting a feature that is available in the software for an unintended purpose. Thirdly, the attackers are going to evolve in their capabilities. There is a significant opportunity for them, both from the intelligence perspective, from the financial perspective, from the community recognition perspective, and as we have been seeing over the past decade or so, and I'll talk a bit more about the details of some of the improvements and evolvements that we have seen in the wild, these innovations are going to continue. They are going to evolve, enhance their techniques and capabilities, and we as security professionals, we are not going to be able to introduce safeguards at the same speed that they would be innovating. So the reality is that the cyber risk is an evolving in nature, and we need to make sure that the business understands that, when making a certain investment is not going to bulletproof you for your life, right? There needs to be continuous monitoring of the cyber risk, and introducing additional controls and capabilities to minimize that risk. And lastly, there is no fear of repercussion. For an attacker that is sitting in China, Russia, or Eastern Europe, there is not much preventive or scaring factors to target organizations in North America and Asia and so forth. And so essentially, if you think of us as goalies, we are essentially taking penalty shots one at a time, right? And it just makes our job very difficult to protect our networks. We should realize that our job as a security professionals is not to stop every attack. The reality is that if the attacker has the capabilities and resources to target an organization, has sufficient sophistication, they would be able to bypass our controls. Our job is to attempt to detect these attackers as early as we can while trying to minimize the impact of that on our company and our critical assets. Now, with that premiere, I guess I just wanted to quickly walk you through the table of content that I have here. We're going to go over some of the stats that we typically publish in our M-Trend report. For those not familiar, M-Trend is essentially a report that we publish as the Mandiant organization every year, where we document the findings from our incident response engagements that we've done past year, and also a number of other red teaming engagements where we actually act as the attackers and target environments. By the way, this report was actually just published this morning, so the stat that I'm going to present is very much hot off the press. By all means, definitely go ahead and recommend downloading it. Now, one of the key stats that we report on this report is basically the industries and distribution of the incidents that we responded to. Now, it's very important to understand that this information by nature is flawed because it's based on the incidents that we have responded to, and we only respond to most major breaches and incidents. Situations that the clients were able to discover quickly, remediate, or non-impactful opportunistic type of attacks wouldn't be covered here. But if you look at the distribution of the incidents we responded to over the variety of industries, the one important fact that you should realize quickly is that all industries are being targeted. And there's not, only few industries that would be the major targets for the cyber attacks. Essentially, every industry, depending on the type of data they have, the cyber operations they have, and the motivation of the actors that are targeting that industry, are going to be targeted and are going to be impacted. In terms of some of the observations from last year, we see that there is increase in targeting and compromise of financial services, retail and hospitality, government and healthcare. And as I will talk to it a little bit further, these evolvements is based on some evolutions and developments in the cyber criminal market that we saw last year, and also a number of nation states that have actually not developed cyber capabilities and are using that as part of their state sponsorship processes. Now, one of the key stats that we report to in our M-Trend report is the dwell time. So from our perspective, dwell time is referred to the time from when the attacker gains access to the network. So think of it as the initial compromise, a spear phishing or exploitation of an external facing vulnerability, until they are detected by the organization, or an external party learns about that and informs the organization, right? And we think this stat or measure is very important because it essentially determines how much attacker has time in order to accomplish their means, right? And if you look at last year, this number was 99 days. So from the time that the attacker established the initial access until they were detected one way or another, it was 99 days. Now, the good news is that this number has been dropping over years. And last year, it dropped by almost 47 days, which indicates that companies are becoming better at detecting these attacks. The other aspect is that you will see about more than half of these incidents are being detected by law enforcement versus the actual company, which is concerning because by the time that law enforcement is informing you that they have a problem, it's probably too late. Attackers has already breached into your critical infrastructure, stolen data, and that's what the law enforcement has probably observed and is sharing that with you. And the other aspect is, the dwell time when an organization would actually detect these activities internally versus when they are informed by law enforcement. On average, I think it was about 88 days for an internal detection versus 107 days for external detection. Again, that is not very significant. Last year, we actually observed that when the external notifications are the result of the detection, the duration or the dwell time was a lot longer. It was around 300 and something days, which points to the fact that law enforcement is becoming better at detecting these attacks. And as I said, the dwell time has been just dropping over the years, which is a really good sign. It just means that we're just generally getting better at detecting attacks. Now, detecting attacks is important, but it's also important to understand at which stage in the process we have detected the attackers, right? If the attackers were detected in the earliest stages of the compromise when they established the system or laterally moved to a couple of systems, the impact of the incident is relatively contained. But once the attacker has actually compromised your Active Directory, has gained access to your critical system, it's pretty much too late to kind of detect them. They have probably came in, grabbed your data, has left the organization, and now you have to deal with the resulting impacts of those. Now, 99 days, again, is definitely a shorter number of days as compared to last year. But what number is good enough, right? I mean, the drop is significant, obviously, and it's important. It's definitely indicative of better detective capabilities. But if you think about this, once the attacker gains access to the environment, he has 99 days, more than 3 months, to stay in the environment and move laterally, perform internal reconnaissance to accomplish their goal. What does that mean? I think from our perspective, that means essentially an attacker is able to gain access to whatever data they're after within 99 days. To just give you some ideas, when we perform red teaming, it typically takes us about 3 days from the start of the phishing campaign until we actually compromise the Active Directory. So 3 days until we gain access to essential credentials that would enable us to compromise data no matter where they are in your network, unless you have some other compensating controls such as segmentation or two-factor authentication. And we can really assume that attackers have the same capability, right? So I think 99 days is really 96 days long, too long. Now, some of the attacker trends that we observed, I'm going to speak to. When I pick these trends, some of them are based on what we have reported in M-Trend report, but also I included a few based on the cases that we observed in Canada. Obviously, M-Trend talks to the trends at the global, across North America, EMEA, and APJ. But I also included a few things that we observed in Canada, which might be interesting to the audience, given this conference is being held in Canada. But if you think about 2016, I see two major trends. One was the cyber criminals, a number of cybercrime cases, and definitely there's an increased sophistication of cybercrime. And the second one was Russian state-sponsored activities. I think the year of 2016 can be marked by these two factors. The financial actors that are targeting organizations to achieve certain goals with the eventual objective of monetizing their access, whether this would be capturing credit card information, PCI, PII, initiating fraudulent transactions, or even taking your data and asking for ransom. And the Russian state-sponsored. And I'm again going to talk about the state-sponsored threat landscape a bit further. Now, talking about cyber criminals specifically, prior to 2013, we thought of cyber criminals as a smash and grab type of attackers. The attacks tended to be very opportunistic. They would target organizations. They would be targeting organizations that would be vulnerable to their exploitation capabilities. They wouldn't necessarily going after that organization that holds certain data that they know how to monetize. They would be leveraging technologies, tools, techniques, procedures, command and control infrastructures that were easy to identify and mitigate. When we had consultants that were working on financial cases, we would always warn them this is probably going to be a straightforward case, because once we would identify the attacker techniques, we wouldn't see a lot of variations from those. In fact, very often we had already ran into these attackers in the past, and we knew exactly the tools that they were going to use. So we could use that knowledge to quickly scope the incident, identify all of the systems that they have accessed, and from there on basically block a couple of command and control infrastructure they were using, remove their tools from the systems, and we would be good. We never saw attackers, financial actors, prior to 2013 trying to get back in or maintaining long-term persistence. Typically, the duration of compromise would have been very short until as soon as they got access to the data that they were after or initiate the fraudulent transaction, they would just leave the environment. Starting 2013, early 2014, we saw that there is a sophistication in some of these cyber criminal groups. There was still opportunistic cyber criminal activities, but we could see that some of these cyber criminals are maturing. They are following a more organized approach. They are using frameworks and codes that are repeatable, but are also expandable. They're using command and control infrastructure that are a bit harder to detect, or at least they could modify those very quickly. So as soon as we would detect some of their command and control servers, they would switch to something else. Now in 2016, the line between the level of sophistication of certain financial attackers and the advanced state-sponsored kind of is not blurred anymore. It basically vanished. We run into financial actors that are behind, the SWIFT attacks or other type of financial attacks, where they demonstrated significant capabilities and sophistication. They use malware that was specifically designed for the targeted environment. The malwares that contained profiling capabilities to minimize the detection rate. They use 0 days, which is kind of rare in a cyber criminal situation, because it takes a lot of resources to be able to obtain and weaponize these 0-day vulnerabilities. They started practicing significant operational security when it comes to targeting the organizations. Historically, they were very noisy. They were not worried about being detected or hiding their tracks, right? We saw that they are starting to leverage anti-forensic techniques to make it just more difficult to investigate them or understand the techniques that they're using for the future. We saw attacks against, innovative attacks against financial infrastructures like SWIFT and other fund processing applications. We saw an ATM malware that was very sophisticated. It would target ATMs, the upper part of the ATM that is relatively less secure, and would basically be used in a campaign that required significant coordination with the money mule to be able to take that money and dispense that from the ATM machine. So we see that these, the financial actors are continuing to evolve their capabilities. Now, mind you, state-sponsored attacks, especially the Russian-based, the Chinese-based, continue to set the bar for capabilities and resources when it comes to, cyber operations. But more and more, we are seeing that line between these capabilities are blurring. And I think it's important to understand this, because when you think about a state sponsor, there are only specific objectives that would make them interested in your profile, right? Typically, they are driven either by political intelligence or commercial espionage, right? Now, those situations are easier to understand. It's more predictable, especially if you monitor the political landscape. You can try to figure out who would be targeting you for the purposes of political intelligence. And many organizations it may not be even relevant to them. If you're mining and there is a political issue between, let's say, Canada and Russia, you're not necessarily going to be targeted, right? But if you think about financial actors, from their perspective, every company could be a target, because a financial actor can monetize one way or another their access to an environment, right? And so that's, from our perspective, is a game changer. Now we're talking about attackers that have the sophistication level of the state sponsors, but have the motivation to target any organization, right? It's all about the level of effort that they have to put in and how much gain they are going to have out of that, right? The less mature you are, obviously there's less effort in targeting, compromising your environment, and more gains from the attacker perspective. Now, this is a case study. I know we have heard about the SWIFT breaches in South Asia. The Bank of Bangladesh were targeted. About 8 million of funds were transferred. The potential impact could have been a lot higher. But I think this case was actually in Europe, where we investigated. Similar idea. The attacker was able to bypass controls, gain access to the SWIFT environment. Now, a couple of very interesting facts here. One was that we observed attackers stayed in the environment and monitored the business processes and learned those. So this was important. Again, not very typical of a nature of the cyber criminals. Typically, they try to be as fast as possible, focus on getting a data or initial transactions, but not really learning the internal process of the organization. So we observe that the attackers sit in the network for a long time until they actually figure out exactly the process for requesting approval, getting approvals, and so forth. The attacker then gain administrative access to the core systems and modify accounts to bypass those business processes. Essentially, they had a 2i approval process. They modified the account to not require any approval, because otherwise, even if they accepted or approved the initial transaction, the owner of the approval account would learn about the transactions being successful. They leveraged malware that hide the track of the SWIFT transactions. But there was also one other interesting aspect here, and it's something to keep in mind when we're responding to breaches of this nature. So typically, banks have a grace period during which they would be able to recover a financial transaction if they realize that it was a mistake or it was fraudulent, right? For the attackers to bypass this grace period, they had to figure out a way to distract the organization from finding out about this fraudulent transaction, right? So what they did was that they created a significant disruption in the infrastructure. They literally basically rewrote the operating system and restarted the servers, essentially caused a number of servers to go down. I think in this instance, we had about 45 systems that were impacted, 29 servers, 16 workstations. So think about when you're responding to a breach like this, right? Assuming that you actually learn about some sort of attacker activity in your environment, by the time that you actually realize the scope of the breach, now you have to deal with a disruptive attack. Just the level of effort and strain that's going to put on your instant response resources, and whether you can actually scale to support both incidents happening at the same time is an interesting factor. Now, another trend that we observed here, and it's nothing new, but I think it's important to pay attention to, is attacks against the emails. When we talk about emails, it's all about spear phishing campaigns and how attackers can use emails to target individuals and compromise systems. But 2016, especially the 2016 United States presidential election, brought email hacking and theft back to the front of the cybersecurity concerns. During the past year, we conducted a number of investigations where we had observed a large amount of emails were targeted specifically by the attackers. So they were not going after private information that is stored in databases. They were just going after emails, right? There were a couple of interesting techniques that attackers used in this process. One of them was the OAuth phishing and delegation. So OAuth is an open standard that is used by applications to authorize access to information without requiring the passwords. Essentially enables you to share information if you have an OAuth token. And we have seen this technique since 2015. Again, nothing new in terms of the sophistication, but I think it's the frequency that is concerning, where attackers would basically use the OAuth tokens, especially for situations where clients are using cloud services providers for their emails, document management, and so forth. In one instance that we investigated, the attacker basically essentially registered a malicious application and send an email, a phishing email to a user. User would click on that application, would install the application and register it under his Google account. As part of this process, the user would be providing permissions to the application. And from there on, the application would have unvetted access to users' data. Now, what is interesting about this process is that it can bypass two-factor authentication, because as long as the application is on the user's device, there is no requirement for authentication. And also, even if you reset the user's password, the attacker would still maintain access to the emails. Now, think about detecting this in your environment. We have found that it's extremely difficult to detect this on the host environment because there's essentially no artifacts on the endpoint, right? It's also very difficult to detect it on the network environment because most of the traffic is SSL protected and encrypted, so you have not much visibility. One way of detecting it would be to monitor your administrative panels and token logs, the OAuth token logs that are provided by your service provider. I mean, how many of you have actually thought through the exercise or the process of obtaining logs from your service providers, your cloud service providers, and monitoring those for the suspicious activities? Your expectation is that your cloud service provider is providing some level of monitoring and security. The reality is that it's a shared responsibility. If you look at their policies and documentation, from security perspective, they would probably be able to secure or guarantee the security of your infrastructure. But when it comes to the application and access to your data, they're heavily dependent on your ability to govern access and data protection. Another techniques that we saw was the Microsoft Exchange Web Services. So EWS, or Microsoft Exchange Web Services, essentially provides the ability to access the data that is stored in your Exchange server using an API over HTTPS. When it comes to the Microsoft Exchange environment, there are different ways that you can access emails. OWA or the Outlook Web Access would support multi-factor authentication, so it's generally a best practice to implement two-factor authentication on OWA or require users to VPN in before accessing OWA. Similarly, for the cloud-based Microsoft Office 365, if you enable the modern authentication feature, you can basically require hosts to two-factor authenticate before being able to access their environment. Now, when it comes to EWS or Active Sync, these would not support two-factor authentication. So typically, the recommendation is for these services to be not exposed to the internet, because attacker, as soon as they gain access to a username and password, they would be able to programmatically access the Outlook Exchange and exfiltrate emails. In a number of instances, we saw attackers, once gaining access to the environment, when EWS services were not exposed to the internet, they would basically laterally move to the Exchange servers, deploy tunneling tools or deploy web shells that would enable them to basically use EWS as a mechanism to access emails. In fact, I think APT29, which is a Russian-based actor, we'll talk a little bit about it later on, used this specifically to harvest emails as part of one of those campaigns against the election. And then lastly, mailbox delegation. In Microsoft, you can essentially, as an administrator, delegate access to a mailbox. You can have one user be able to access other users' emails. Again, we observed this technique in a number of APT attacks where the attacker had basically delegated access to users' emails, to actually multiple users' emails, and from there on they were able to steal users' emails. So just generally thinking about how you can protect your emails, and it's not all about the endpoint. There are so many other ways that attackers can actually compromise your emails in the environment. And there's also so much information that attacker can go after that is really just stored in your emails. Email is definitely a very interesting, the source of information for a number of attackers, especially state sponsors where they are after commercial espionage. Many of the business decisions are made and are documented within the emails. But also we have seen email compromise being used in scenarios where cyber criminals are trying to initiate a fraudulent transaction, where they would try to understand the business processes that leverages email. For example, invoicing is a very good example of that. Intercept that process, modify the emails, and as a result of that, initiate a fund transactions to an illegitimate target. And phishing, phishing is not going away. Obviously, there are technologies that are more effective at detecting phishing campaigns. The sandboxing technologies that would detect attachments. Now, some of those are getting better at actually analyzing the links that are embedded in the emails. Some of them would actually look for username password in the content of the email and use that in order to, decrypt the encrypted content for the purpose of analysis. But I wanted to point this out because we continue to see innovative approaches by the attackers to bypass these controls. One example that we saw was very interesting, where attackers actually call the user to teach them how to enable macros on Word, right? Or another example where they social engineer the user to providing their personal password, email account, and target them through the personal email account because they want to bypass the email controls that are in place. One other example was the use of chat, enterprise chat software. For example, Skype enables you to be able to reach to people, especially if you have a federated account and register that with Microsoft. So you don't even really need to go through the email route to reach the user. So just think about the different ways that attackers can get to your users and entice them to click on the link. Email is definitely not the only way of achieving that. Now, when it comes to multi-factor authentication, it's certainly one of the effective controls that we have recommended many years to our clients. The idea here is that you don't want to protect your most critical assets just based on a username and password, because it's easy for an attacker to obtain access to that username and password, either through the compromise of, let's say, your Active Directory, or just phishing the user to entice them to provide their username and password. We also always recommend using multi-factor authentication for both, the mechanisms that provide remote access to your environment, so externally facing services, but also your critical infrastructure internally, your administrative jump boxes, your critical databases, and so forth. While it's as an effective technology and capability, I think it's also important to emphasize areas where attackers are actually bypassing these capabilities based on gaps in configuration, operation of the environment, or just genuinely leveraging the variety of techniques that are available to the attacker. So this is, again, not a new trend, but again, as more companies are leveraging these capabilities to protect their data, we see more and more attackers are leveraging different techniques to bypass them. Some of those can be prevented. Some of them may not be as easy to prevent without using other technologies. So one way we have seen attackers bypass multi-factor authentication, which is very similar to phishing, is the pass-through with multi-factor authentication. So essentially, they entice the user to click approve on their token. They will send an email. The user will go to a legitimately looking website that asks for the username and password, but at the same time asks for a token authentication, and the user would provide that. Once the token is approved, the attacker would use that for other activities. Essentially, they would intercept the one-time password. Another example is the enrollment of the tokens. So we have seen in a number of our red team engagements where we would compromise the environment, and then certain targets are protected by two-factor authentication. In these scenarios, the first thing that we're going to do is to look for the token registration emails in users' email accounts. Some of those actually are so old, about 3 to 4 years old when the user initially joined the organization, but would enable us to essentially register a new token for us and use them. So it's definitely a good practice to make sure that those are removed or expired after they are initially issued. One instance, we saw attackers exploiting an XSS vulnerability on the portal, on the VPN portal, that would essentially enable the attacker to capture the tokens, the one-time tokens, and pass them to the attacker. One other example is when attackers would go after the multi-factor authentication itself, right? Sometimes your multi-factor authentication provider is already integrated into your domain admin. So as soon as the attacker is able to compromise your Active Directory, they would be able to gain administrative access to your, let's say, RSA server, and from there on, they can essentially register themselves with new tokens. Another, opportunity we have seen in many clients is where they have, these groups on Active Directory that are exempted from performing multi-factor authentication. So the attacker simply would need to just add a user account to this the group on Active Directory, and from there on, they would be able to bypass two-factor authentication. And lastly, again, nothing new. We have seen in situations where the second factor is not secure enough, an attacker are able to exploit that and bypass multi-factor authentication. One example of it is certificate-based authentication, right? These are situations where the certificate is stored in the registry key as non-exportable by the configuration. But once the attacker is able to compromise the system, they are able to export that certificate from the registry and use that on their own systems. The best practice configuration for two-factor authentication is that the two factors should be independent from each other, right? So when you have the user and password on the same system stored in the cache, as well as the certificate again on the same system, it's not really true two-factor authentication. So we have seen that being exploited in the wild for bypassing multi-factor authentication. In terms of malware trends, there's obviously a lot of different malware samples that are produced every day. You hear these crazy numbers of 2 million malwares every day, or 98% of the malwares are only used once, and so forth. So there's going to be continuous innovations there. And at the same time, we're finding that the technologies are getting better at detecting executable-based malwares, DLLs and EXEs that can be run in a sandbox environment and detect activities that are typically not associated with legitimate software, very indicative of malicious content. When it comes to a script-based malware, we find that technologies are lacking. These are situations where attackers would use, let's say, VBA script or PowerShell, macro-enabled type of content in order to bypass the detection and gain initial compromise. And so we saw that expanding in 2016, a lot of use of PowerShell in the initial compromise phase, and that's just going to continue. We also see that for macro-based enabled documents, attackers are using unexpected formats that are not very well known, or at least planned by the security technologies. We saw attackers using the Microsoft Publisher document files or the Microsoft Windows 2007 template files, the .m files, and also the PPT the template files. So we're going to see a continuation of these activities where they find more innovative ways of bypassing sandbox or execution detection capabilities. When it comes to ransomware, I'm not going to talk a lot about it. Obviously, there's going to be a significant increase on the ransomware attacks. I think the one projection by Beasley was that the expected the number of ransom attacks is going to be doubled by 2017. But we have also seen that law enforcement has made significant progress in mitigating those. We do foresee law enforcement is going to continue to catch up here and target ransomware situations, especially when they are relatively opportunistic and we have a large audience. Now, when it comes to ransomware, a couple of interesting trends that we observed was that historically, when somebody is initiating a ransom campaign, they wouldn't target an individual or an organization. They would distribute to as many people as they can, because the more people have an opportunity to click on it and get infected, the more money the attacker can make, right? And from the attacker perspective, this is a really good return on investment, because the level of effort that it takes to prepare a ransom and execute on that is relatively low. You don't need to customize that to your targets and so forth. Now, in a number of situations, we actually observed targeted attacks using ransomwares. And these some were actually initiated by a state sponsor to cause disruption. So once they gained access to the target environment, they leveraged Active Directory to deploy ransomware across the board. Now, all of a sudden, all of their servers were actually encrypted. Other situations where cyber criminals have leveraged ransomware, again, in targeted situations where they would go and identify most critical systems of the organization that holds the data and deploy ransomware purposely to that specific system. And again, lastly, the MBRs and VBR-based malware. So these are malwares that would basically target the layer underneath the operating system, your master boot record or volume boot record, to bypass all of the controls that you have within the OS. In fact, in one of the financial cases that we had, the attackers solely relied on VBR-based malware to maintain persistence in the environment, which just points to the fact that there's just going to be more and more use of this for the persistent purposes. It's very hard to detect. The technologies of today are not are not designed to detect this, and at the same time, many of the investigators are not very familiar with these new advanced persistent mechanisms. Now, extortion is not a new trend. You don't even find that in the M trend, but in Canada, we continue to see extortion cases. What we mean by extortion is the attacker gaining access to the environment, compromising the data, taking the data out of the environment, and then reaching back to the company and asking for a certain amount of fund, normally in the form of bitcoins, and threatening that if he does not receive that data by so and so date, or that fund by so and so date, they will go ahead and publish that data on the public, or they would sell that data in the underground market. The typical ransoms would range between 50K to 800K, or even higher amounts, depending on the value of the data that the attacker has gained access to. Now, extortion campaigns are important and goes back to the discussion around the advancement of the cyber criminals and financial actors, in the sense that I think, again, every organization could be subject to this. You have data that is important to you. Maybe the attacker cannot sell your data in the underground forum to make money from that. The PII or credit card information is not as significant to your environment, but there has to be data that is important to you from the competition perspective, from the reputation perspective. That's what the attacker would go after. So it's a bit of the shift in mindset, where you always think about who would be interested in my data. I think it becomes the question of what data is important to me rather than to the attackers. One group that we have specifically seen significant level of activities in Canada, we refer to them as fake Tesla group. So they're not the real Tesla group, and we have a number of reasons why we think that's the case. But I think the first case that we investigated from this fake Tesla group, or FTT, was back in 2013, when they had targeted an organization in the mining and resource industry. They had compromised the data. At the time, they actually introduced themselves as angels of truth. So they had not even adapted the the Tesla team name. They stole the data and they basically just published it on the internet. And at the same time, they asked the company to stop their mispractices. They were very generic in this process, didn't really talk about what mispractices they're talking about. And they also threatened that if they don't basically publicly announce and apologize, they are going to basically post more data and cause disruption. Now, in this case, the company obviously didn't even learn about this because the email that they received initially was ignored or was spam filtered. And so the attacker actually went ahead and caused disruption on the systems. And the method of disruption they used was very, very simple. They basically overwrote the whole C directory with 0 and restarted the system. I think as a result of that specific incident, the company was not able to pay their employees because the SAP system was down for about a week or so. And think about a mining organization that, with the SAP system that is dysfunctional. It was definitely very significant. Now, over the years, we have seen them to improve their capabilities and also figure out ways to monetize their access. In terms of the sophistication of or capabilities that they have or the tools that they use, we think they are relatively unsophisticated. They are not using very advanced customized malware. They typically leverage open source malware, PowerShell scripts that are available to anyone. And they are very consistent in terms of their methods of operation across different targets. But we see that they are, depending on the type of the data they gain access to, the amount of ransom could range. I think the initial case where they asked for a ransom, it was around 40K US dollars, and then the last one they asked for ransom of about 500K. So you can see this natural evolution of these attackers. Now, if you think about a general extortion attack, we think they're going to be very profitable to the attackers, and also going to be very interesting to the attackers for the main reason that the level of effort that it takes to execute on one of these is significantly less than the level of effort that would require to, let's say, for example, initiate a fraudulent transaction. All the attacker needs to do is to compromise system, escalate privileges, laterally move, copy as many files as they can from your shell, and then from there on, they can basically ask for a ransom. So that's why I think this trend is definitely going to be continued, and there's going to be more and more cases that we'll hear about in Canada specifically. An interesting fact about Tesla team was that all of the targeting that they've done that you're aware of is in Canada, and just by nature of targeting, it's very interesting. They're just focusing on the Canadian organizations. Some of the lessons learned from these, the disruptive attacks and consideration is that before taking any actions, you want to confirm that the breach is actually real and the attacker has access to what they're claiming to have. Now, typically, they would basically share with you samples of the data that they have, right? Now, from your perspective, you need to have two immediate objectives. You need to understand that your data is gone, and when the data is gone, it's gone. You don't have any control over that, right? You should immediately focus on understanding how they are maintaining access to your environment and how you can remove them. And the second question that you need to answer is what kind of data was taken. So make sure that you don't get distracted with other aspects of negotiation with the attacker or payment versus not payment. Those are important, but do not distract your information security capabilities and resources on those factors. Now, when it comes to paying the ransom, it could go really different ways, right? The reality is that data is stolen. You could potentially save your data from being published, at least publicly, by paying the ransom, but there's also a chance that the attacker would actually ask for more ransom after you pay them, or they would just go ahead and simply publish your data, even claiming that they got the ransom and now they're paying, which could have potential reputational concerns. And Maybe lastly on the attacker trends around the state-sponsored activities. Um, what initially we observed in the state-sponsored threat landscape, China was obviously significantly active in this area for a number of years. I think since in early 2000s, they target many organizations for a number of reasons, mainly around the commercial espionage, where they would go after the data that would be important to a state-owned company from the competitiveness perspective, or intelligence-based data, or political intelligence data, where they would use that as part of their political objectives, or to ensure the stability of their environment and promote their objectives. Since 2014, mid-2014, and especially September 2015, when US and China agreed on a treaty that neither government would conduct or knowingly support cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property, we have certainly seen a decrease in the number of targeting and intrusions by China against North American companies. That is not necessarily the case for the activities of the Chinese cyber operations in the region. So we still see targeting against Australia, Japan, South Korea, and so forth. But definitely in North America, we are seeing less and less of China activities. But then, on the other hand, we have seen a significant aggression on the Russia side. Russian cyber criminals are very effective. They also exercise significant security in their operations, so hard to detect. And we have seen basically a significant aggression being exercised by the Russian actors against the North American, European, Eastern European specifically companies. Two of the groups that we have heavily seen, especially in US and some activities in Canada, are APT28 and APT29. Both groups are very sophisticated. We have seen them leveraging, the zero-day vulnerabilities or vulnerabilities that were just published but were not weaponized, so their time to weaponization of these vulnerabilities are very short. And are very innovative in the different ways that they would target organizations. It seems that they have access to significant development capabilities that would enable to adjust and customize the tools when they're targeting an environment. For example, APT28, we have seen, since 2007, they have been just developing code based on a very flexible and modular framework. They are heavily incorporating the content analysis capabilities to make sure that there are runtime checks in place and essentially making it more difficult for intrusion detection systems to detect those activities or analyze them. The use of OAuth, the vulnerability or issue that I talked about earlier, strategic web compromises, and in one case for a Canadian company, I actually remember they basically compromised the user credential using NetBIOS spoofing on a Wi-Fi network that the user was connected to. So the user was traveling to a conference. The attacker was able to compromise credentials by acquiring that over the Wi-Fi. And within hours, they used that to access the organization. So that's definitely, they're finding different ways and very innovative, less repetitive in terms of the techniques that they use. Definitely very consistent in terms of the objectives that they have and the relevance of that to the Russian government policies. I only have 5 more minutes. Just very quickly, I want to talk about some of the defensive strategies. The reality is that obviously the cyber risk has been identified as one of the major potential impacts to the business, and many companies have invested significantly in this area. In the past year, we saw many organizations that acquired capabilities around automation or hunting. Automation makes sense because as IT professionals, we have invested heavily in different technologies and point solutions for security, which has resulted in the significant alert fatigue. We get plethora of data, and our job as security, handlers, incident handlers, is to monitor these alerts and identify, the signal within the noise. And something like automation would be helpful because you can basically try to minimize the amount of time that your resources are spending on day-to-day mundane security activities and focus on areas that would bring most value, like hunting. The hunting is thought to be the process by which a human actor would basically sit down and analyze your data. It's not very alert-based driven. Rather, it's a very human-centric process. Focuses on building hypotheses around if the attacker was going to target my environment, how would they come in, and look for the specific data that would represent that. Hunting is important because some of the attacker techniques, especially within the lateral movement, privilege escalation, and persistence, is sometimes very difficult to detect by technologies because they essentially hide in the day-to-day processes and operational activities within the environment. Now, all of that being said, we continue to see that companies and organizations are lacking when it comes to fundamental security practices. The reality is that our networks are not built with defensibility in mind, right? And getting a technology is important, developing advanced capabilities are important, but that's not going to replace the fundamental requirement for the cybersecurity. In fact, when these fundamentals are not in place, these advanced technologies are not going to be as effective at performing their job and reducing the risk. When it comes to some of these fundamental concepts, definitely understanding your crown jewels, your systems that would represent your critical data. What systems are running which applications and which applications are using which data that are most important to your business. Think about restoring these capabilities in a cyber situation that is disruptive. If the attacker, destroyed your systems, your tier 1 systems, how quickly can you actually rebuild them and start from scratch? Visibility is key, especially when it comes to endpoint visibility, because historically we have had a lot of thought given to where we can incorporate network visibility. When it comes to endpoint, we don't have the level of depth that would be required from the investigation perspective. But also some of these new areas that we're getting exposed to. How do you monitor your cloud? How do you monitor your BYODs? How do you monitor your integrations into the a variety of third-party vendors that you're connected to. Credential management and multi-factor authentication, we talk about those, but almost in every incident that we respond to, as soon as the attacker gain access to the environment, they would go after your domain credentials. How do you make sure that you minimize the number of domain credentials, use unique password, and ensure that the administrators are exercising sound policies in using those admin credentials. And network segmentation and data segregation. The impact of a security incident could be significantly less if we sufficiently protect our most important data. The reality is that we cannot protect everything at the same level. It's important to take an intelligence-based approach, understand your exposure, try to reduce your exposure as much as possible, resolve as many vulnerabilities as possible. Understand what is important to you and your business and what kind of protection do you have around that. And then prioritize your investment and services to basically focus on what is most important to your environment and establish those capabilities. Hopefully, if you're breached, you're able to detect the attacks, and by just making it more difficult for the attacker to eventually obtain their objective, you're essentially increasing your chance of detecting them. I almost ran out of time. If there are any questions, I can answer. Go ahead. Go on. So the multi-factor authentication, there are different types of it. There is the hardware-based tokens, there is a mobile, there is a text. We definitely don't recommend text-based multi-factor authentication. Typically recommend the software-based or hardware-based. Most important thing is that you make sure those two factors are actually independent from each other, right? An attacker, by compromising one channel, is not able to compromise your two factors.
Thank you. So with regards to state-sponsored attacks, Russia may not really want to cover their tracks. They're making political statements by not doing so. But with regards to China and other countries that you're saying you're seeing diminishing profiles of them, is it not more likely that they're simply going underground and covering their tracks and as a result, diminishing any political flack that may result? I mean, do you actually believe that there's diminished attacks coming from those?
From China,
yeah.
Specifically? We think it's not, I guess in terms of frequency, it's diminished. In terms of focus and success, it's not. And what we have seen in China's activities is that their activities are a lot more focused. And I think it has to do with a number of factors. One is obviously the US government, the agreement with the China government. There was significant exposure of Chinese activities, but there is also significant streamlining and coordination within their military services. So we think they are just becoming more effective at directing their effort in accomplishing very specific goal. What we observed from China was that there was a decrease in targeting of the commercial space, but their activities against the governments, especially for the purpose of political intelligence gathering, continued, right? So I think the capability is there. At some point, they will probably use it, but it's going to definitely be more focused and coordinated. All right. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.